So IFC, as part of the World Bank Group, is focused on the private sector. We invest in the private sector, currently about $20 billion each year. We are driving that up further, and we are driving it up further because there is an international consensus, really, that in order to reach the Sustainable Development Goals that the international community has set itself for 2030, so we have 10 years, we will need the private sector to be part of the development solution in a very big way. So we need to bring the private sector in as much as is possible. There's a very large infrastructure gap in Indonesia, but also elsewhere. If we look at fiscal situations in many countries, this cannot be filled by the public sector, and it shouldn't, because the private sector will often be in a much better position to provide and manage the infrastructure that is needed.
Well, if we see what's happening right now is some private sectors are working together with the public sector and building infrastructure and everything, but we rarely see private sectors doing so on their own. And what do you think should be the awareness here to encourage the private sectors to be involved in development in general?
It's clear in Indonesia there's much more scope for the private sector to be involved in infrastructure and certain other areas. And for that, the government has to provide the right framework. So for instance, for PPPs in waste to energy, that is something that Indonesia is looking at. This is something that can easily be provided by the private sector in combination with agreements, contracts, in which the public sector sets the right framework. So you need that framework. You need
certainty.
You need certainty around the environment, legal, about the tariffs you're going to face, and then the private sector can come in. And I could tell you that same story in sector after sector, from hospitals to the provision of a variety of infrastructure services.
And what would still be the challenges in private sector development in 2020?
In 2020, I think Indonesia would make a big step forward by passing the laws that are now under consideration, so-called omnibus laws, to unblock obstacles to development. From what we understand, these laws are going to tackle a whole range of issues that are today making it more difficult for the private sector to move forward. And if that happens, it really raises the potential of the economy as a whole.
Indonesia is actually ratcheting up our infrastructure, has been for the past 5 to 10 years, and under our President Joko Widodo. And do you think that infrastructure financing would still be interesting option for private sectors to come in?
I think it will be increasingly interesting for the private sector to come in, because much of the infrastructure drive over the last few years, very successfully, has been by state-owned enterprises. And they are also reaching naturally certain limits to their capacity. And then you have to open that space for the private sector. So it would be very attractive for the private sector. We have looked, as IFC, together with our partners in Indonesia, at a whole variety of possibilities at the municipal level, for instance, in green infrastructure and green building, etc., in which it is attractive for the private sector to invest. So there should be a shift in the balance from the state-owned enterprises to the private sector in the coming years, and I think that is also what the government is intending to do.